Hey, good evening, or at least it's evening for me. I am making this video from home tonight, and I apologize for not getting it to you before the weekend was over, but here we are on Monday night, and I'm going to try to do some short videos so that over the next few days, you can watch them as you have moments of time to try to catch up from week 9, which was last week, and this week is week 10. So we're going to cover over these two lectures from week 9 and week 10 the broad idea of authority and how the church relates, the authority of the church relates to other authorities that God has given to us, ultimately to Christ's authority. So the title of week 9's lecture is Scripture, Tradition, and the Church. And so in this video, I want to actually talk about, I'll bring up this PowerPoint here. I want to talk about the first of these, and that is Scripture. And so we're going to look specifically at the Reformation principle of Sola Scriptura. What do we mean by Sola Scriptura? What do we not mean? We're going to ask the question, in what sense is Scripture alone as an authority, and in what sense is it not alone as an authority? So again, in this video, we're just going to do that. And then in the next video, we will take a look at tradition. And then this week, week 10, we'll take a look at church. So we're going to try to bring all of that together. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that in the time I have, but let's at least, let's shoot for that. All right. So what I want to begin with here is some disputations. So let me quickly go through this. So I believe, and these are statements that can be debated and ought to be debated and argued, that Scripture, number one, Scripture bears apostolic authority. That is, Scripture is given to us, to us today and the Christians before us, by the apostles, who themselves were authorized by Christ and also were themselves Spirit-led. So Scripture is certainly God-breathed, but is God-breathed to the apostles and is from them that we receive this. So in that sense, Scripture, it has apostolic authority. And the reason this is important is because we have to understand what kind of authority does Scripture have. And I'm going to share in a moment how we can fall into, and many evangelicals have fallen into, a bibliolatry. That is where Scripture is authority itself, and it's not even a derived authority. It kind of replaces the Word, the incarnate Word, rather than it is the Word of the Word. It contains an authority that is given to it by the Spirit who is bearing witness to Christ. So I think the number one point is very, very important to understand. Now, I'll share another, in the next slide, I'll share a point on that. Number two, Scripture lies within and above Christian tradition. So what I want you to get in this one is those two relationships that I'm referring to here. Scripture lies within tradition, and Scripture lies above tradition. I will show you in a minute, or at least I'll give you some Scripture passages that show how Scripture actually appeals to tradition. But then at the end, when the canon is closed, when the canon of Scripture comes to an end and it's closed and it's sealed, and the Spirit authorizes it as Holy Writ, that then Scripture is in a position above tradition. And then third, we're going to spend most of our time tonight on Sola Scriptura, which is an element. It is one element in a matrix, or what I call a divine economy of authorities. In other words, God has placed in our lives as Christians, He has placed multiple authorities for our salvation, chief of which is Scripture. But it is not the only authority. And so we're going to talk about in this lecture, and then this week, week 10, Scripture, tradition, and church as three of three elements in the whole authority or economy of authority that God has given to us. All right, so that's what we're going to do tonight. And let's begin with this very important scripture, which I hope you will find a way, some way to work this into your final essay. Make sure you do that. Put an asterisk next to it. 2 Thessalonians 2:15. Make sure you have that marked in your text. I think the first essay question that you are answering has to do with the relationship of the church to the Trinity, relate the church to Christ. So you can talk about images that are used in relation to Christ, images of the church, relate it to the Spirit. So again, you can use images as they relate to the Spirit. I think that's your first question, but I think there's probably even a way to work this into that question. Because of the relationship of the Spirit and Scripture, and the role that we will articulate tonight, the role of Scripture, that Scripture has authoritatively for the church. But then I think the second question there, it has to do with the church's role in our salvation. And I think this would certainly be applicable to that essay question as well. 2 Thessalonians 2:15, you have the text right here on the screen, and relating it to our own salvation. Notice this. He says, "Brother, stand firm and hold to the traditions that you were taught by us, either by our spoken word or by our letter." So Paul is instructing the church to stand firm and hold to the traditions of the apostles. That's what he means by us and our. And those traditions at this early stage, 2 Thessalonians being one of the earliest books of the New Testament, included, notice, spoken words and written words. Which would eventually become what we call Scripture, the New Testament. But that in this, again, as it may apply to that second essay question, there is something about the preached word that pertains to our salvation, and there is something about the inscripted or Scripture, the written word that has to do with our salvation. Those are two figures of authority in the economy of authorities that God employs in our life. All right. So there are a couple of. Actually, I asked this question. Then we're going to dive into two other questions here pertaining to this principle, this Reformation principle of Sola Scriptura. Okay. So Sola Scriptura, as you know, is one of the solas of the Protestant Reformation, and it is what Van Hooser calls actually probably the most difficult one to retrieve because it's been so abused, misappropriated, misunderstood. And he says here, as you can see, Sola Scriptura turns out to be not a uniter, but a divider. At least that's the prevailing narrative on the academic street. And there are many theologians, they're not difficult to find, who are conservative, by the way, who would affirm the infallibility of Scripture, but still reject Sola Scriptura because they believe it is the Reformation principle that kind of opened Pandora's box to division within the Protestant the movement away from the Roman Catholic Church. And so you'll have concepts such as, there are nearly as many Protestant denominations as there are interpretations of Scripture. So Van Hooser, he responds to this, accusation that, that all disunity in the Protestant Church is because of Sola Scriptura, this principle, and so therefore ought to be rejected. Van Hooser argues against that. He is arguing for preserving the principle, but also recognizing that it has been misappropriated and needs to be more carefully explained. And so he actually does that and I'm relying heavily on him and his works, several different works that he talks about this. And for these next two questions, one is, in what sense is Scripture alone? And then the next question is, in what sense is Scripture not alone? So let's answer the first question on the that he poses, and he actually, I think, answers this question second, but I'm going to put it first. So this again is kind of my distillation of Van Hooser. These are not all quotes from him, but I think they accurately represent what you would read from him. So first of all, Scripture is alone in that it is the primary and ultimate source of theology. And what's really important, and I want you to note this, okay? What's really important is that these words, primary and ultimate, because I would, in fact, you ought to make sure you know your own church discipline. I know what it is if you're Bible Methodist. I'm not sure what it is if you're not, but you should look at your articles of faith, look at the Scripture article, and look to see if it says something to the effect of, Scripture is the primary and ultimate source, all right? Versus some, because I've seen them in the CHM, I've seen, and broader holiness movement as well, I've seen articles of faith in church disciplines that say something like Scripture is the only source of theology or faith and practice or something like that. That's very, very, very different, all right? That's not what this is saying. That's not what Sola Scriptura means. Sola Scriptura means that is the primary, ultimate source, not the only source. And so we'll get to that when we ask in what sense is Scripture not alone. But that's really, really important to understand. All right, so secondly then, in what sense is Scripture alone? Scripture is alone in telling the story of Jesus sufficiently. And in other words, in conveying the gospel and conveying it fully and clearly. Now, we have to be careful with the perspicuity or the clarity of Scripture, because what that does not mean is, it does not mean that we are guaranteed that if we handed out Bibles to every man on the street, that if they just took that Bible alone and read it apart from the church, that they would always and necessarily come to Orthodox Christian faith, because in fact, that's not true. History has proven that people who take Scripture and read Scripture alone don't always end up at Orthodox Christian faith. Many of them end up in what has been declared as heresy. And so, but nonetheless, it is only in Scripture that we find the full gospel and the gospel in its clearest exposition. All right, so that's what this point number 2 is. Point number 3 is that Scripture is alone in the sense that its sufficiency, it is sufficient for revealing how then to live out the Christian life. Not only what the Christian life is, but how to live it out. Not only what the gospel is, but how to live the gospel life. And again, this all goes together. So it doesn't mean that Scripture is the only source for Christian living, but it is alone the only sufficient source, full and clear, containing everything that's necessary for salvation, as the articles of England, the 39 articles say. All right. So Van Hooser will appeal to 2 Peter 1:3, and I'm going to pause for just a second. So give me. All right, apologize for that. Because I'm home, I may have some disruptions, but I will try to keep them to a minimum. I think my kids decided to come down for a snack. So, all right, so 2 Peter 1:3. So Van Hooser uses this scripture to make this point, saying his divine power has granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness. So that's kind of the key phrase for Van Hooser in him making this point of the sufficiency of Scripture for the Christian life. All right, let's go to next point. Here, I mentioned earlier the 39 articles, which do say Holy Scripture contains all things necessary for salvation. And by the way, if you attend or if you are part of a holiness, any church in the Methodist tradition, if your articles of faith in your church discipline do not have this statement, then first of all, advocate for it. But secondly, it means that someone has intentionally changed it. And it's actually been, it's a fascinating study. I would certainly recommend if you have any interest in doing some theological research in the holiness movement, particularly the conservative holiness movement, just do a search and comparison of all of the articles on Scripture across the board. So I did that several years ago, and it's truly fascinating. And I looked not only at the existing articles of faith across the movement, but then I looked at previous church manuals. So if some denominations have updated their church manual 2 or 3 or 4 times, and so I would collect those, and it's amazing to see the changes that they make to this article on Scripture. And it's very, very, very telling in some cases. So, I won't give you, all of my conclusions and all my research, but it's very interesting. But make sure you know what your own church says on this, because it's very, very crucial and may need some theological reflection. All right. So again, we're asking the question, in what sense is Scripture alone? And the fourth sense is this, that Scripture alone contains the substance for multicultural rules of faith. Now, this point is a summary, and I don't think I have, I do have the book here. Okay, it's called Globalizing Theology. It's actually propping up my tablet right now, so I can't pull it out. But it is, it's a book called, maybe I can't. Let me see if I can do that. All right, so I apologize if things get shaky here. But, okay, so here is the book, Globalizing Theology, edited by Craig Ott and Harold Netlin. Harold Netlin, by the way, is one of my favorites when it comes to theology of missions. But anyway, in that book, Kevin Van Hooser has a fairly lengthy article called One Rule to Rule Them All, playing on Lord of the Rings. One rule to rule them all. And his whole point is this right here. This is my distillation of all of what he says there, that it is Scripture alone that holds together the various expressions, Latin and Greek, and later European, North American, African, Asian statements or confessions of faith. It is Scripture alone that provides that is the kernel of truth. So all of those confessions, when compared, are only contain truth insofar as they are reflecting or communicating the substance of Scripture's teaching. So he actually gives an example. Let me see if I can find it in my notes. He gives a great example. It is, So he responds to, or he uses this example of the Nicene Creed, where the Nicene Creed describes the relationship of Father-Son as homoousios, right? So if you've taken systematic theology, you recognize homoousios is a major creedal statement, doctrine. It's a dogma that is maybe more than anything else crucial for determining orthodoxy or heresy or heterodoxy. And he says, that is an articulation of what Paul means in Philippians chapter 2, equality with God. I think it's in verse 6. And so Scripture has that truth, equality with God, Father and Son. Son is equal with the Father. And the creed then, Christians found it necessary to use other words in order to communicate what Scripture means. And that key word homoousios became the hinge. And so I'll actually talk about this a little bit later, what it means to be biblical. And so in that sense, the Nicene Creed is a biblical faith. So to the point that if someone denies homoousios, then they are being unbiblical. They're denying the faith of Scripture by denying the faith of the Nicene Creed in this case. So Scripture alone contains a substance for multicultural rules of faith. And that's not pluralism. That's tying down a very diverse church. It's tying them into the only authority, the Spirit-breathed word, which is Scripture, the only authority that can hold all of that together. Apart from Scripture, the church is not multicultural. That's really the point. Okay, so in what sense is Scripture not alone? All right, these are really important, and in fact, I would say these are as important as the previous ones, and I think I have 7 points. Again, most of these are drawn from Kevin Van Hooser, so let me go through them. First of all, Scripture is not the sole source of knowing God. Now, we ought to just know this from Scripture itself, right? So Romans chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, Psalm chapter 19, verses 1 through 7 or so, all tell us that, and others tell us that we can know something about God through what we call general or natural revelation. Now, sure, we can't know as much about God, but Scripture itself is not the only source for knowing God. So in that sense, Scripture is not alone. Scripture and, so some people would, some of the 19th century Methodist theologians would call it, the book of nature, and you have the book of God. You have you have these working together, nature and special revelation. They cohere. All right. So number 2, Scripture is not the sole source of theology. Again, I've touched on this, and I would challenge you, and I would strongly urge you, look at your own statement and your own church's statement on Scripture. What's it say? Does it use the word only source, or the only standard, or the only rule for faith and practice? I think that's usually how it's said. It's the Scripture is the only rule. Well, that's not what the Reformers meant by Sola Scriptura, and that's not what we ought to mean by it, because Scripture is not the sole source. Now, yes, it's the primary, yes, it's the ultimate, but it's not the only or the sole source of theology. So I remind you of the Wesleyan quadrilateral of Scripture first, right? Tradition, reason, experience. Of course, that predates Wesley, but Christians throughout history, even in the New Testament, they didn't only appeal to the Old Testament. They appealed to experience, they appealed to reason, they appealed to even tradition. And so Scripture has never stood as the only or sole source of theology. So that's not what we mean, and we should not mean this by Sola Scriptura, all right? 3, and this one takes some explanation, but and Van Hooser has written a lot on this issue right here. Scripture is not the sole text, quote, for being, quote, biblical. Now, in just a minute, I'm going to talk about what does it mean to be biblical. Actually, I'll probably do that in the next video. But here, let me see if I can summarize what Van Hooser means. Okay, so number 1, he has a massive book called "Is There Meaning in This Text?" Which, if you haven't read, you ought to read sometime. But so first of all, text, by text, he means any form of communication, oral, written, even unspoken. All of that's a text. Everything is any form of communication is a text. So let me go back to the example that I just referred to earlier. The Nicene Creed and homoousios. All right. So homoousios is part of a text, the Nicene Creed, which must be, we believe, affirmed in order to be biblical. So if we believe that, then we are confessing implicitly, I mean, that entails the belief that Scripture then is not the only text or the sole text for what it means to be biblical. You do today. If you, as a teacher at God's Bible School and College, if I denied homoousios, I would be considered a heretic. I would not be biblical, and yet the Bible doesn't use that phrase. It's the Nicene Creed that uses that phrase. And so that's an example of what this means right here. Scripture is not the sole text for what it means to be biblical. Number 4, Scripture is not the sole source of authority for our public life. Now, this touches on church and state. So we're going to talk about church and state in, I think, 3 weeks. This week 10. So yeah, I mean, it's coming up soon. And so this one's going to come up again. But here's what's important, all right? What's important is to understand that Scripture does not answer certain questions that public policy raises. So Scripture does not settle the argument on whether or not the wealthiest 1% should be taxed at a higher rate than what the rest of us are. It doesn't answer that, or I should, let me put it this way. It doesn't say that there ought to be a flat tax, or that there ought to be, that the wealthier ought to pay, 1% or 2% more than the rest of us. It does talk about justice, though. It does talk about, someone just started some music over here. All right, I think it's gone. But it does talk about justice. It talks about fairness. It talks about helping the poor. It talks about all sorts of things that are related to that. But it doesn't answer that question. It doesn't answer the question of what the speed limit ought to be. But it does talk about loving our neighbor and driving carefully and being careful of looking out for the safety of our neighbors. It does give some guidance, but it alone won't answer many of the questions that public life presents. So we'll actually look at, in a few weeks when we talk about church and state, we'll actually look at a major movement from the 20th century that's still around today, called Reconstructionism, that believes that Scripture ought to be the only source of authority for public life, and that we ought to get rid of the Constitution and become a theocracy where Scripture. Okay, so what questions that raise? It inevitably raises the question then of whose interpretation of Scripture then is authoritative for public life. Oh, didn't think about that. Well, maybe they did, but the Reconstructionists wanted their interpretation of Scripture to be authoritative. Well, there's a lot of problems with that. All right. Number 5, Scripture is not the sole source for interpreting Scripture. Oh man, this is a huge one. All right. I have a lot of notes on this one. I don't have time to go through all of these, but let me make some points. Let me see if I have this on here. Yes, I do. So this is what this is how he posed the question. He says, whose say-so speaks for God's say-so? All right, brilliant way of asking the question. Scripture is not the sole source for interpreting Scripture. So he says, Sola Scriptura cannot be, this is Van Hooser, he says it cannot be limited to 2 common principles that we practice and observe. The first one being that the part interprets the whole, and we use the whole to interpret the parts. Okay? Yes, we do that. That is a valid method for understanding Scripture. The second one is that difficult passages are interpreted in light of clear passages. Yes, we do that. That's a good practice of interpretation. But Sola Scriptura is more than that. And here's the point Kevin Van Hooser makes. Those 2 principles, interpreting the parts by the whole or the whole by the parts, interpreting difficult passages by clear ones. That's true of any text. That's true of the Constitution. That's true of the cookbook we have in the kitchen. That's true of these history books I have behind me. These are all presidential biographies behind me. That's true of any book. And so Sola Scriptura means more than that. And he appeals to very interesting. I wouldn't have thought of this, but he in a couple of his writings, several articles, he refers to. Let's see if I have it on here. Yes, you remember this in Acts chapter 8. You remember Philip encounters the Ethiopian eunuch, right? So the Ethiopian eunuch is traveling and he is reading the Old Testament, Isaiah 53. And Philip hears him and approaches him, asks him the question, do you understand what you're reading? And what was his reply? How can I, unless someone guides me? And so then Luke tells us that Philip explained it to him and then, of course, was whisked away by the Spirit. So Van Hooser focuses in on this question. How can we, unless we receive guidance? In other words, this is an interpretation question. How do we understand Scripture unless it's explained to us? His point is Sola Scriptura, all right, is not the sole source for interpreting Scripture. Now, I'm going to, in another video, because we're going to come back to this. Yeah, when we talk about tradition, we're going to come back to this, and we're going to ask ourselves, who is Philip today? What does Philip represent for us today? And Van Hooser gives three really interesting points for consideration on that. Who is the guide, or what is our guide for today? In other words, this question: who speaks for God, or who interprets what God is saying correctly for us? That's a really, really important question. And that's a question that this Sola Scriptura does not answer. So Sola Scriptura, Scripture is not alone in the sense of being a sole source of interpreting Scripture. Yes, we use Scripture to interpret Scripture, but Sola Scriptura is more than that. And in fact, let's look at some ways that it is. That Scripture is not alone. First, the Bible does not run. This is Van Hooser's words. The Bible does not run by itself apart from the Spirit. This is so important. By the way, I love chocolate milk. So since I'm home and not in the office, I can have my chocolate milk tonight. All right. So he says the Bible does not run by itself apart from the Spirit. So here's what happens: is some misappropriation of Sola Scriptura has actually detached Scripture so that you have this text, and the Spirit is not only the Spirit may be acknowledged as the author, but then in the interpretive process, the Spirit is eliminated as if all I need, and this is often under the guise of the perspicuity of Scripture, that, well, it's just all I need is, anyone can read this. Well, that's certainly not what Paul said, right? I mean, Paul, quite clearly said, in Corinthians, that we have to have the Spirit. They are not naturally understood. Things of God are not understood by our fallen nature. So we must have the Spirit's help. So so Jesus said he would send the Spirit, and it would be the Spirit who will teach you all things. So Scripture is not alone in interpreting Scripture. We must have the Spirit. Not only that, second, we must never try to interpret Scripture, or we must not think that we will necessarily come to Orthodox Christianity independent of the church, which, according to Paul in 1 Timothy 3:15, is the pillar and foundation of the truth. So the Scripture, the letters of the Gospels, the New Testament. It was all written for the purpose of being shared with the church, being read in community. And Scripture is to be interpreted within the believing community. So again, this is all to say that Scripture is not the sole interpreter of Scripture. Yes, we use Scripture to interpret Scripture, but we also need the Spirit. We also read the Scripture in connection with other believers. And third, in connection with tradition, believers who have gone before us. What has the church said? What have believers who have gone before us said about Scripture? Or what has their understanding been, and how can that help us today? And of course, we can appeal to 2 Thessalonians 2:15 again, where Paul says that the church is to stand firm and hold to the traditions that have been given to us by the apostles. All right. So let's conclude this video with a list of what counts as biblicism, or you might prefer the word bibliolatry. I'm using them interchangeably here, although you will see the word biblicism used sometimes not in a pejorative sense, but in maybe something positive. So for instance, Van Hooser does use the phrase critical biblicism in a positive way, but generally biblicism is viewed as something to avoid. Well, here's what you should avoid, all right? Now, biblicism would include any of these following elements. I think I have about 7 elements here. So it doesn't have to include all of them, but any of these practices counts as something that is not Sola Scriptura, all right? Again, all of this has to do with Sola Scriptura, which has been misappropriated in a biblicist, or what would the word be, to cause a person to fall into bibliolatry. And so we want to avoid these. So number one is limiting divine revelation to the written text of Scripture. All right, that simply means God has revealed himself also through nature. God reveals himself especially through the Spirit. The Spirit is not limited to Scripture, even though the Spirit is not, presently inspiring other Scripture. The Spirit certainly speaks to persons and when he speaks, he always speaks authoritatively and speaks of Christ, and always consistently with Scripture. But we do not limit divine revelation to the written text of Scripture. And that's primary focus here is that nature itself does speak of God. And so that's really, really, really important. So to say that God does not speak outside of the text of Scripture is a biblicist belief, and we are not biblicists. Number two, attributing to the Bible sole authority for the Christian life. So again, this goes back to my point that check your church manual. Does it say that it's the only source for faith and practice, or does it say it's the primary or the ultimate source for faith and practice? Because it is a biblicist view or a misappropriation of Sola Scriptura to say that it is the only or the sole authority for Christian life. And Hooser calls this, or refers to the people who say, I have no creed but the Bible. Well, then in that case, you don't have to affirm homoousios. But that, of course, would make you a heretic if you denied it. All right, next. 3, it is biblicist to exclude all other sources as authoritative for public life. Now, this doesn't mean you have to include all the other sources, but if you take a Reconstructionist view that only the Bible is authoritative for public life, church and state, public policy, that would be a biblicist approach. Now, in public life today, it's not unusual to hear media, even judges, certainly other politicians, to identify anyone who tries to use Scripture to just inform public policy as a biblicist. Well, that's a misappropriation. That's an attempt to redefine what it means to be a biblicist. All right, that's not what biblicism means. It means someone who would refuse to use other sources for, say, development of public policy. 4, biblicism includes holding one's own interpretation of the Bible as the definitive interpretation or meaning of Scripture. It's a conflation of the authority of Scripture with the authority of my understanding. And I can affirm the infallibility of Scripture without affirming my infallibility of understanding, because that does not follow. All right. And number 5, biblicism includes viewing biblical theology merely, okay, so that word is important because merely means that biblical theology includes this, but is more than the scientific exegetical process of letting the text have its say. That's how Van Hooser puts it. So he will argue against D.A. Carson, who does not understand systematic theology, in my opinion, and in Van Hooser's opinion, to say, biblical theology cannot be limited to the scientific exegetical process of letting the text have its say. And I strongly agree with him. I think it's very problematic. And I think biblical theologians, including exegetical theologians, such as, forgot his name. That's first name. Anyway, wrote a massive book, massive biblical theology, but he really takes to task, takes to task other biblical theologians for really narrowing or restricting biblical theology to something like this right here. Barr, what was his first name? One of you probably know. All right, number 6. Biblicism is naively treating Sola Scriptura as a general hermeneutical principle. And what he means by this, Van Hooser calls it biblical positivism. And that is that you don't need the Spirit, you don't need the church, you don't need tradition. All you need is the Scripture to interpret Scripture. All right, so that he said, no, that's naive. That's naive biblicism. And then, I guess, connected to that point, number 7, is to interpret Scripture outside or apart from the church is a form of biblicism. To say, I don't need to see what, church history says, or I don't need to, I don't need someone else's, input on what Scripture says. I can do it alone, all by myself. So interpreting Scripture outside or apart from the church is biblicism. That's bibliolatry. And by the way, again, this point here could be used, several of these points could be used on a final essay to talk about, for instance, what role does the church have in my salvation? Well, it has an interpretive role. The church has an interpretive role in our salvation, in my salvation. We'll talk more about the binding and loosing authority that God gives the church. We'll talk a little bit about that this week. So the church has a significant role in our salvation. So, all right, I'm going to end this. So thank you for watching. Sorry about a couple of disruptions there, but I hope this video makes it to you in good time and that you are able to watch it before we meet on Thursday. All right, I look for another video to come after this one.